The Prime Minister has accused the Chinese military of reckless intimidation, while Defence Minister Peter Dutton says the behaviour is unacceptable. The ADF says 10 personnel were on board the aircraft at the time and the act had the potential to endanger lives. Let's bring in our political panel now. Ebony Bennett from the Australia Institute and Dan Wild from the Institute of Public Affairs. Great to see you both. First to you, Ebony. Ebony, the Prime Minister says China will have to explain their actions and describe the incident as an act of intimidation. What's your take from the Prime Minister's response so far?
Well, whether it was an act of intimidation or provocation remains to be seen. The Chinese government certainly has some explaining to do, and we should hear what they have to say. But certainly the Prime Minister was accurate to call this irresponsible and dangerous. Aiming a laser at an aircraft is reckless. It puts in danger the safety of both the aircraft and the air crew aboard, and either this is an ill-disciplined Chinese Navy or indeed this is Chinese government practice, in which case it's extremely belligerent. And the reality is, if China wants to be treated as a great power, it has to behave like one. It can't be behaving like an undisciplined novice.
Dan, we've heard strong condemnation from both the government and Anthony Albanese as well now. This is a developing situation, of course, but what's your take on the responses that we've had so far to this incident that happened earlier this week?
No, I agree with Ebony. I think the Prime Minister's response was bright. It was measured, but also firm. It didn't go over the top in terms of inflammatory rhetoric. And what this shows is that the region that we're in and the world more generally is becoming more uncertain. China is becoming more hostile, more aggressive. And there is, I think, a big question mark at this point in time as to whether Australia is ready to deal with that uncertainty. We saw just last week, Kenny, that Origin Energy announced that Eraring, a coal-fired power station in the Hunter Valley, was going to close 7 years earlier than what was previously expected. Now, that's 25% of New South Wales electricity supply, which is our largest state, is going to be turned off. And that outcome was a direct consequence of the policy of net zero emissions by 2050. We cannot replace that amount of coal with batteries and solar panels, 80% of which are imported from China. So Australia is at a big risk of not being able to have sovereignty over our electricity infrastructure. We're also got a risk that we can no longer manufacture the critical supplies that we may need. And what it shows is that net zero emissions is no longer just an economic issue, it is now a risk to our national security.
Ebony, Defence Minister Peter Dutton says he disagrees with ASIO boss Mike Burgess on Sky News after Mike Burgess's comments that politicising national security issues was not helpful amid increasing attacks from the coalition against Labor over China. Is Peter Dutton's strategy to challenge Labor on this starting to backfire?
It's incredibly risky. And let's be clear, what the coalition government has done this week, in particular the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister, is just start a flat-out scare campaign. And the fact that the Director General of ASIO felt it necessary to do a public interview on primetime national television to defend the integrity and non-partisanship of his organisation, but also to rebuke and reject the weaponisation of national security for partisan purposes, is absolutely extraordinary. And a former Director General of ASIO coming out to effectively describe the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister's behaviour and rhetoric this week as in China's interests and not the national interests is alarming. I also think we need to consider the impact that this is going to have on Australians with Chinese heritage in this community, because the message that's been sent out this week is effectively that if you visit China, you're suspect. If you're giving a speech in China or you speak Mandarin, that's somehow suspect. And unless you're overtly hostile to the Chinese government, that somehow there's a cloud of suspicion hanging over you. Australia needs to be able to have a more nuanced national security debate than that. We have to consider the divisions that this could create within the community, and ultimately, this kind of absolutely nasty rhetoric is only going to divide Australia and make us less secure.
Dan, what's your take now that the Defence Minister and the head of ASIO is now at odds over national security as a partisan issue?
Well, firstly, Kenny, I think that there's no question as to the head of ASIO's motivations. I think he's 100% committed to Australia's security, and he's made the assessment that he's done what he thinks is necessary to forward that objective. However, my take is that it was overreach and counterproductive to the overall outcome that Burgess was trying to achieve. Yes, in a sense, national security is becoming politicised, but it's important to remember that we live in a democracy and we're heading into an election in a few months' time with national security, whether it's to do with China or Russia, is becoming an issue of greater importance to many Australians, and that deserves to be debated. Now, Australians will decide whether they believe one side or the other side is better placed to deal with national security, as they'll make that decision when it comes to a range of other issues, be they economic, social welfare, tax policy. So this is the nature of living in a democracy, and there was nothing untoward about the coalition's line of argumentation last week.
All right, guys, a slightly lighter topic for you now. Ebony, international borders are opening tomorrow. Flight Centre CEO Graham Turner says what they need now more than anything is a guarantee and confidence that borders are not going to shut again, no matter what variant comes our way. Should Scott Morrison be making that guarantee?
Well, if I were him, I certainly wouldn't be, because I think he would be writing a cheque that he can't cash. The state premiers have effectively shown that they are in control of Australia's borders throughout the pandemic, and they've always had paramount amongst their concerns protection of the community, because after all, it's the state governments that run hospitals that get overrun in these situations. So I think probably the Prime Minister would be foolish to make such a guarantee because he couldn't enforce it. And I think the reality is, if there were to be another flare-up of the pandemic, border measures and border controls are one of the options that state governments and premiers would certainly be looking at. I, for one, hope that we don't have one and that Australia's borders remain open. But we've dealt with the pandemic extremely efficiently compared to most other countries, and we wouldn't want to sacrifice all of that gain that we've made over the past 2 years, all of the lives that we've saved, if again the pandemic flares up and we choose to secure the borders in order to protect the community. That should always be an option.
Dan, do you agree with Ebony that making a guarantee like that is fraught with danger, because you don't know what's going to happen in the future? There might be another wave in winter.
I agree in the sense that it is a state government responsibility primarily, so Morrison making commitments around domestic borders would perhaps be futile, although on international borders, of course, the Commonwealth has jurisdiction over that area. But more broadly, I think the head of Flight Centre has demonstrated an important example of leadership in the business community that has been missing over the past 2 years. The key word that he used was confidence. And I would argue politicians and policymakers ought not to just be giving confidence on borders, but confidence on lockdowns and restrictions. Australia simply can't go back to the way we've dealt with the virus over the past 2 years. And I think state governments and federal government should be making a guarantee and a commitment. There'll be no more domestic lockdowns. Schools will not be shut down, and the mandates will end, because we can't have another 2 years like we've just had over the past 2 years.
Great to thrash it out with you both. Thanks so much. Dan Wild from the Institute of Public Affairs and Ebony Bennett from the Australian Institute. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Kenny.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.